The wet and damp shelter was little more than a frozen cage. The walls of snow were pressing in as if it was trying to suffocate any life inside. Virginia Reed sat huddled against the walls, cold, wet, and starving beyond imagination. At 12 years old, her brain struggled to comprehend the gravity of her situation. Around her, hollow-eyed figures lay motionless, wrapped in thin blankets, their breasts shallow. Faces that had once been full of hope and strength were now gaunt and lifeless. They had all been pioneers, dreaming of California's golden fields. Now they were prisoners of winter's merciless grip, bound by snow and hunger. Nearby, a mother clutches her children. She was too weak to reassure them, while others resorted into dispatching the family pets, giving their children one last chance at survival. The snowstorm would rage outside for days and turning into weeks. The group would descend into utter chaos. The only consensus that they seem to agree upon is that nobody would be forced to eat someone in their own family. They were known as the Donner Party, and they were running out of time. I want to thank everyone for joining in today. We're going to be taking a look at the entire story of the Donner Party. I want to keep continuing to bring you guys stories that are fully baked and don't need to be propped up by TikTok dances and Tide Pod challenges. So I hope you guys like it. If you haven't clicked that subscribe button, please do. It really helps the channel. And as always, I don't want to keep you away from the story, so let's move on. Now, it was the spring of 1846, and 87 men, women, and children would begin their journey westward. They were carried by 20 wagons and nearly 100 oxen and cattle. They would call themselves the Donner Party, after George and Jacob Donner, two middle-aged brothers from Illinois who, along with the Reed family, would lead this hopeful group of settlers hopefully to a new and prosperous life. Their destination was California, which was part of Mexico at the time. However, that was starting to be contested by the United States. And the Donner Party envisioned a life filled with green hills, fresh soil, and land ownership that would give them the ability to build wealth for generations. Their wagons were loaded with essentials that would last them through the 5-month trek. Each wagon would carry barrels of flour, cornmeal, salted pork, coffee, sugar, and dried fruit. Now they packed things like blankets and winter clothing, guns, tools, seeds, and everything they would need to get started on their farms in California. Now the expectation is that they would reach California by late summer and they would take the famed Oregon Trail. Their plan was to travel west from Independence, Missouri, following the well-marked trail up along the Platte River. They would pass through what's now called Nebraska and Wyoming before eventually descending into the Great Salt Lake Valley. Here, they would skirt across the rugged Nevada terrain and essentially try to make their way from here to California. They had mapped out each leg of the journey, even with the expected distances they would cross each day. They were hoping to make about 10 to 15 miles, and even had checkpoints and dates that they were supposed to reach during each part of the journey. Now, as they made their way across the Great Plains of the Midwest, the choice was presented to them that would alter the course of their journey. Word reached the party about a supposed shortcut known as the Hastings Cutoff. This new route, advocated by an author called Lansford Hastings, who was a promoter for settlements in California, essentially promised to save over 300 miles by bypassing the established trail and crossing directly through the Wasatch Mountains, taking them west faster than any trail before. It was untested, it was a gamble in every sense of the word, but extremely tempting for the group. Now, the chance to reach California sooner really appealed to the group, and James Reed, who was one of the more ambitious members in the group, urged everyone to take the risk. Now, it's important to note that within this group, not a single person had personally known anybody that had taken the trail. They're getting this information from a kind of information book or pamphlet that was published at the time, and they had no real reason to doubt it other than common sense tells you this might be a bad idea. Now, the group was divided. Some were urging caution, saying that this unproven path is too high risk. Ultimately, the group, influenced by Reed's confidence and their own eagerness to arrive before winter, everybody supported the idea of going through the Hastings Cutoffs. And right before they actually made the final decision to take the shortcut, On August 6, 1846, the party reached something called Weber Canyon. At that time, it's important to note that pioneers traversing these areas would stop over at Fort and often leave messages to each other about the conditions of trails and things like that. And in Weber Canyon, they actually come across a note that was left by the author of the book, Lansford Hastings. And in this note, he warns people that there's difficult terrain ahead, that it's not safe for wagons, and that it's full of rocky, steep terrain. And basically, if you got a wagon party, to turn around and go the other way. Now, again, Reed and some of the members of the group are adamant that they're still going to take the shortcut, despite protests in the group. So here, they veered off the established trail and embarked on this shortcut, hopeful that their decision would eventually pay off. But as the miles wore on, the folly of their choice would become evident. This shortcut, that was a cruel misnomer. The terrain was brutal. It was far rougher than they anticipated. Across the Wasatch Mountains, they were forced to cut down trees and clear a path, pushing and hauling their wagons over rocky passes. What should have been days ended up costing them weeks. They fought their way through steep and narrow canyons, struggling to keep their animals fed and their party moving. Water was absolutely scarce, and heat in the desert was merciless. Oxen began to grow weak, and at one point they lost several heads of cattle and oxen from contaminated water. As the supplies were beginning to dwindle, frustration was truly gnawing at the group's morale. Now, to point out, I said the anticipated journey to travel or traverse this few thousand miles from the Midwest to California would take them 5 months, but the one situation they never wanted themselves in was for this journey to essentially go any longer than the autumn and into winter. So losing time for these people was a huge impediment to their journey. Virginia, who's barely 13 at the time, could begin to sense the adults' rising tensions. The once hopeful conversation of California's orchards and farmlands turned into whispered worries around the campfire. She watched as her father, James Reed, became increasingly uneasy, and his confidence started to become shaken by the grueling pace. Now, the Hastings Cutoff was supposed to save them 300 to 400 miles on their journey, and not heeding Hastings' advice, they end up losing a whole month of traveling time, and they don't emerge from the shortcut until September 26, 1846. So exiting the Hastings Cutoff wasn't the end of the trouble, because they would have to cross the Humboldt River, which ends up causing the group further delays and ends up causing them to abandon even more of the wagons because they just couldn't get all of them across, and one of them ended up flipping off into the river. But again, here's where some of the members decided to bury their supplies. One of the German members of the group, Wolfinger, who was an immigrant traveling with his wife Dorothea, had hired 2 teamsters to help drive his wagons. And he sends his wife ahead and decides to go back and bury his supplies in case they ever come back to get them. And his 2 helpers, Josef Reinhard and August Spitzer, said, you know what, we're going to help you bury the gold. And what ends up happening is they follow him back there, end up murdering him, burying him with the wagon and supplies, and going back and telling his wife that he was murdered by the Pawnee. Now, a lot of people in the group doubted this. They doubted it. They didn't buy his story, but they were in this desperate kind of push to get the hell out of this Hastings Cutoff that nobody really had time to question it. So the group would emerge from the Hastings Cutoff fighting, and not until pretty much autumn. Now, this is extremely precarious because they're starting to get into the time of year where you'll see snow collecting at altitude, and the decision has to be made by the group, have we gone too far, and should we turn around? It's here that they would regroup and make another push towards something called Truckee Lake. Now it's been renamed Donner Lake, which you'll understand why later. The decision is made to essentially keep moving on rather than backtrack and seek shelter in a fort. And honestly, I don't think that the group likely felt they would have even been able to backtrack at that point. It was so hard getting through that canyon, and they didn't come out the other side of that shortcut as a whole group. They ended up losing around 36 head of cattle and oxen, causing them to abandon most of their wagons and supplies. Things like food, tools, and personal belongings were just too much for the group to carry and were buried along the trip. So another important thing to note here is that by the time they had reached Hastings Cutoffs, they had traveled like about halfway through the journey, almost like over 1,000 miles, and their animals were already in rough shape. People were dehydrated. They had lost one of their member, a young person named Luke Halloran, of tuberculosis, right before they entered the Hastings Cutoff. So the group is not doing so hot. Now they've had to abandon their supplies. They just lost a bunch of their cattle. I can't imagine the sense of kind of helplessness they were starting to feel, because in front of them was still probably around 1,000 to 1,300 miles of journey to get to California. Not to mention that they were now essentially in the Sierra Nevada mountains, which were not a place that you wanted to be in the fall. They're not doing so hot, but they got to push forward and make up for the time that they lost and get someplace either safe before winter or maybe by the grace of God, make it to California. Now, the landscape would just end up growing harsher by the day. The path they'd fought through the Wasatch Mountain with ended up costing them enough time that they would start to see snow slowly gathering on the mountain peaks. In the evenings, young Virginia would sit close to her mother, clutching her and her siblings, listening to her strain. Often, she could hear the angry voices of adults shouting around the campfire. Her stepfather, James Reed, had become a vocal advocate for pressing on, but his pride and determination seemed obvious even to his own daughter. And there seemed to be an increasing fear and resentment building among the group, something that young Virginia just couldn't process. Each night, the camp seemed more divided, with one side always urging caution, begging for the group to turn back and try and make it back to the closest fort. And then the other side, led by James Reed, insisting that they push forward to California as quick as possible. To Reed, every delay felt like a death sentence. He couldn't bear the idea of turning back after coming so far. He was responsible not only for himself, but his wife and children. And in total, believe it or not, there was 48 children on this trip who are now witnessing the adults around them descend into arguing, fighting, bickering, not having a sense of direction. I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been for the young people in the group. Some of the group, including George Donner and a fellow named Patrick Breen, feared that pushing on would further drive them into the mountains into worse and worse weather, and they would essentially end up becoming stuck because of winter. They heard rumors also from the native Pawnee that snow could bury some of these trails for months at a time and make it not only completely impassable, it would completely make it impossible to survive. Now, tensions would flare at every setback. At one point, when one of the wagon wheels actually broke, forcing the group to stop and repair it, it ended up causing a giant argument amongst the group. And this argument starts escalating into threats back and forth, and people are screaming. There's these heated exchanges going on. And in one of these moments, an altercation happened between James Reed, Virginia's father, and one of the teamsters that was driving one of the wagons, John Snyder. Now, the account says that John Snyder actually took the butt of his whip during this argument and struck Reed across the face and also struck his wife. Reed would then turn around, plunge his knife straight under his collarbone, essentially, killing him on the spot. Now, Reed was known to be somebody that had a short temper, and he had already been pushing a lot of the groups. So even though he was defending himself, immediately everyone starts to turn on Reed. The group decided that they felt Reed, it was too dangerous to continue on with him. Essentially that his stubborn drive to just keep pushing forward, his unwillingness to hear other people's opinions, and essentially people just started to think this Reed guy didn't have their best interests at hand, and they decided to basically kick him out of the wagon party and say, you got to go your own way or you're going to be hung. And they didn't just kick him out, they kicked him out without supplies. And so young Virginia has to watch her father essentially being walked off to his death with no guns, no provisions, and basically hoping he'll make it out of the mountains himself alive. Virginia, like it said that when he left, she was completely devastated. And I can imagine you see that father figure as your hero when you're a young kid, and you're in this terrible turning into like the start of a survival situation where you're low on supplies, everyone's fighting. I could imagine like the only thing that was making her feel safe was that guy, and he had just left the camp. So very scary time, I imagine, watching Reed leave the camp. It's at this point that the group would start to fracture. People had different ideas of who they wanted to lead the group, and also different ideas of how they wanted to go about completing this journey. Now, this is something that, again, shows to go you like the strength of family and those bonds, is that young Virginia, realizing the situation that her father was put in, or stepfather, and not necessarily trusting the group, actually snuck away shortly after her father was sent away, and she ended up catching up to him on the trail and essentially stocking him up with some supplies, guns, and tools that he would need for his journey. And they make a promise essentially that they're going to meet each other on the other side. This act of defiance and bravery on Virginia's part showed how deep her loyalty and love was for her father. Despite the danger and tension surrounding his banishment, she risked punishment, her own banishment, and to get this guy what he needed. And that little act might be something that ends up coming into play later in the story. Like the same way all these little bad decisions end up committing so many people to a terrible fate, this is a decision that will come back later in the story in a huge way. Now, through it all, the children of the 48 children that are in this group, they're having to witness their own parents and the entire people that are meant to be their sole protectors essentially during this journey completely descend into chaos and fall apart, bickering, arguing. Now they sent Reed away, they had to elect a new leader. And George Donner would take leadership over the party. He was said to be someone that was calm-minded. He wasn't necessarily as assertive, but he also wasn't as experienced as Reed. George Donner's approach was definitely more cautious, and he felt like we couldn't push the group too hard. We didn't want to exhaust the remaining animals that weren't doing so hot, but not everybody agreed with him. And what ends up here is you start to see the groups fragment into smaller, either family units or groups of people that some want to push forward, some want to go maybe more back to try to find shelter, but they start to split up. Now, George basically sticks with what's called the main caravan. So this is like the animals and the supplies, the little bit of supplies that they were able to actually get through the Hastings Cutoff. And then what would happen is that there would be other groups that would move further ahead, trying to essentially see how the trail was, come back and give advice. And at some point during the fragmentations, two people, Graves and the Eddy families, felt that time was their greatest enemy. And one of the things is that they believed their only chance of survival was to essentially reach California before the snow set in, even if it meant pushing ahead of the group and diverging from the main group as they saw fit. So what that meant is that this group was going to push away and basically leave everyone behind. So now, as time would wear on over the next few weeks, the Donner Party slowly just fragments into smaller and smaller groups, each navigating the trail as they saw best rather than sticking together. Now, it's said that I think at times there's about 3 or 4 main groups, and all of them were basically moving at different paces depending on whether they had wagons, young children, if maybe they had old people who were not doing so hot. Now, each group seemed... So now this fragmentation means that you have people deploying 4 different strategies to basically make their way through the mountains. One being that they're going to take their time and not injure themselves, slow and steady. The other one is like rushing through and beating winter. So it started to slowly become every family for themselves. And then I mean that in every sense of the word. People are starting to have to make decisions to stop sharing supplies because they were running out of the last bits of food. They were having to make decisions like not treating injuries or going back for help for people that had severe injuries. But yeah, to wrap up or summarize in that part, you got 4 groups heading in 4 different directions, all trying to get to the same place. So this takes us into October, and the Donner Party and the group is in the heart of the Sierra Nevadas, and snow had begun to fall earlier than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just covering the mountaintops now, it was blanketing the trees and the paths in a silent and suffocating white. At first glance, Virginia thought this was absolutely beautiful. the ways the snowflakes would dance through the sky, coating everything in a delicate shimmer. But soon she realized that this beauty was in a deadly trap. The snow piled higher and higher, turning trails into treacherous slopes, swallowing their wagons up to the axles. They had no choice but to start burying their supplies from the wagons underground, and maybe, just maybe, someday if they made it through this, to be able to come back and get it. Very quickly, George Donner's group realizes that they're trapped, at least for now, until the snow melts, and hopefully it wouldn't last too long. So they start to make makeshift shelters. There's not a lot where they are, so they have to just basically get pine branches, make tarps from like rawhide, coats, you name it, anything they can to shelter themselves from the biting and freezing wind. And it was like a wet snow, so it was like this heavy, damp, it just sucked everywhere you go. They could barely keep fires going. So like these cabins themselves were not in any way, shape, or form like a cabin in the sense of, oh, it's comfy. Like it's literally just a pile of branches and things that you can insulate yourself from the cold and wet with, if you're lucky, maybe an oil lamp or something in there. Families huddle together in these cabins and basically try to keep each other warm with their own body heat. Now, I can't imagine as they're sitting in there trying to keep warm that there's not a part of them like these alarm bells going off because of their decision to take the Hastings Cutoffs. They don't have supplies for the winter. So if they can't walk out of here, they might not be getting out of here. Now, as the snow began to pile up, it said that at some points you couldn't even see the horses and cattle. But unfortunately, they would start one by one to succumb to the weather, the lack of food, and lack of water. Their bodies were quickly put to use, with the rawhide being used to help with the shelter, and every last scrap of bone and meat being used to feed the people that were stuck in these shelters. Now, though food supplies were plentiful at the start of the trip, I mentioned that they lost a lot of this during the Hastings Cutoff. And what they basically had at this point was scraps of dried meat, flour, and a little bit of cornmeal. Every single piece of this had to be rationed down to the smallest portion, so that people ended up boiling and eating rawhide, and they were also basically trying to cook the bones and suck the marrow out. Each day, the adults would measure out small portions, their faces drawn out with worry as they watched their stores dwindle and dwindle, and as they calculated how long that they could hold out. Each person's ration was slowly growing smaller and smaller by the day, until all that was left was the bitter taste on their tongues and the acid from their stomachs. A reminder that survival was slipping further and further from their grasp. Unfortunately for the Donner Party, they had expected that the snow would let up, and it just didn't. They'd now been here about a month, and the snow in spots was said to be up to 10 feet deep. Not only did it kill the animals, it completely trapped them. When I said they couldn't move, like there was nowhere for them to go. And if you've ever tried to walk in snow that's even as deep as, say, your knees, it's like trying to run as fast as you can. Like your heart's pounding, you want to die. So if you have this mountain snow that's like multiple feet deep, like these people, just to give you context, moose and deer, when the snow gets over a few feet deep, they have to either rely on each other to pound down trails, or if they don't, they'll actually get stuck and the lighter wolves will come along and just eat them while they're standing still because they literally can't move. So snow is literally winter quicksand. It's not someplace you want to be, especially with 48 children. We're not talking all adults here. The dynamic of that group was not set up to survive any kind of situation like this. But as the snow drifts grew taller and taller, they realize like there's no escape and they're not going to make it out of here. Now it's like into the end of October, early November. They know they're not getting out, that they are stuck here for the entire winter. Now weeks would pass, and the only sound that the group would hear is howling wind through the trees and the occasional whisper of people praying for rescue, people crying, and the whimpers of the kids starving to death slowly. Virginia could feel the cold setting into her bones, the frost creeping into every part of her, till she felt so numb, not only from the freezing air, but from the fear that had gnawed at her so long that she became used to it. And unfortunately for both Virginia and her family, things were about to get worse. The survival tactics that they would try seemed to be almost as pointless. They ate whatever they could find, strips of boiled leather, ox hides, sticks and grass, tree bark, and just about anything to fill their stomachs, just to keep the pain away. Adults, it said in the group, were beginning to appear gaunt, weak, like they were ghosts. Their movements became slow and measured. People were trying to conserve energy in every possible way. Virginia remembered stories of pioneers who had hunted and foraged and relied on the natural world for food. But here, there was no chance. There was nowhere to forage. There was no game because they were stuck. They couldn't even see beyond the next shelters, let alone walk there. It said that at one point they were able to kill a timber wolf or a gray wolf to get a little bit of sustenance, but that was like a one-off, and that doesn't feed a lot of people. We're talking, 80-something people at that time, so yeah, that's not going to go far. Now, at this point, it's all the groups that are getting trapped up in the mountains, some not as bad as others, but some of the camps or some of the groups were only like 300 to 400 meters away from each other when they got stuck, and it was said that they couldn't even see each other because the snow was so deep. Only thing that they were able to notice was like the smoke rising up from the fires. And now, as Christmas would begin to approach, Virginia is realizing the gravity of the situation. It's not just that survival is unlikely, it's that she has to wait for her own demise. Now, the endless snow and the relentless cold weren't enough. People and adults in the group would start to descend into madness. Only thing that would keep Virginia going in these moments was that thought of the land of golden fields and fruit-laden trees, all the things that filled her dreams before the trip. But she had no idea what both Mother Nature and the universe had in store for her. Survival, day in and day out, started to become a routine of boiling leather scraps and keeping each other warm. The days blurred together. Virginia would hold on to a single hope that one day her father would come back for them. As did much of the group. They couldn't help but think, did James Reed make it out? Was he going to send help for them? He may have been their only hope at that point. She clung to this thought of him, imagining him braving the wilderness alone, cutting through the snow, determined to find a way to rescue them. Each night, as she huddled close to her mother and siblings, she whispered to herself that he would return, that he would find them, and that this nightmare would end. In the darkness of the makeshift shelter, the small acts of kindness lit up the cold, like the last embers of a fire. Virginia's mother would gently press a piece of hard biscuit into her hand, reminding her to savor it slowly and enjoy each bite, letting it melt slowly on her tongue. Sometimes when Virginia looked at her mother's hollowed eyes, thin and pale, the face of her younger siblings as well, she'd offer them a tiny portion instead, hiding her empty hand under her blanket to spare her mother's worry. Despite the grim reality, small moments of warmth persisted, binding the families together in their shared misery. Children whose faces were now drawn and gaunt would sit close, sharing whispered memories of home, laughing softly about things that they had once done or seen. Virginia and the other children would imagine themselves somewhere else, letting their imaginations take them away from the frozen hell they were living in. They would speak about their favorite foods, weaving visions of dinners around the fire with more food than they could eat, a distant fantasy that let them escape if only for a few minutes. Virginia found herself drawing her strength from these moments, from the thought of rescue from her father, from the thought of fruit and orchards in California. Though the adults tried to protect the children in the party from the weight of despair, offering comforting words, hopeful promises, and sometimes even a joke, it would become apparent through their voices that not even they believed they were getting out of there alive. Unfortunately, as we know, Mother Nature doesn't care about your hopes and dreams, and all you have to do is watch the precision and callousness a wolf or a bear takes a newborn calf moose into its mouth and turns it into prey. There's no thoughts of well-being or dreams, it's just pure, cold predation. Coming into December, the last crumbs of grain had been gone for days, leaving the group with nothing to sustain themselves. It was at this point that they began to take animal hide from the oxen yokes and even the saddles, literally just eating the leather just to fill their stomachs. The depth of the snow completely buried any roots, any plants that they might have been able to essentially try to grow up. Only thing is that they were able to catch, actually, besides a wolf, was small little mice or vermin. And it was that one of the members was so desperate for food, they had actually taken one of these and eaten the thing whole and raw. Virginia definitely understood that everybody in the group was reaching the end. At this point, all the groups are grappling with the same reality. No food, deep snow, and nowhere to go. George Donner's camp at Alder Creek started to feel like they lived in their own isolated world. George himself ended up falling ill, leaving his wife Tamsin and the others to manage as best they can. He had an infection from cutting his hand. Now, Virginia was up at the Donner Lake camp, or Truckee Lake, with the Graves and the Breens. And here is, like I said, they're at the point where they're out of food. It's absolute desperate survival. Things get worse because for the Graves family, every day their children became weaker and weaker. Now, we're talking children that are like 4 or 5 years old. It's here that people would start to succumb to Mother Nature. The first person, Bayless Williams, was a teamster who was driving the wagons with reeds. He ends up succumbing to exhaustion and cold, passing from the starvation, lack of energy, hypothermia, you name it. Now, shortly after he dies, this obviously affects the morale of the group. The Graves and Breens helplessly watch as young Lemuel Murphy, weakened from both the hunger and cold, fades quietly. They've been taking care of young Lemuel since his mother, Lavina, had passed away. For Virginia, the sight of another child slipping away was almost too much for her. It exposed this brutal reality that nobody wanted to face, and it was the future that every single person in that group was likely to face very soon. So even in the face of death, Virginia still tries to push her body through this hunger, the pain, the starvation, but things just didn't get better from there. So in the face of death, members of the group start to realize there's nothing we can do even for our own kids. Like, they're starting to succumb to the scurvy, all the diseases that come with starvation and hypothermia. And a few members of the group decide that they're going to get every last person that's healthy enough, and they're going to try and make a push through the snow using makeshift snowshoes and try and go find help. The 15 that were setting out knew that this was such a Hail Mary, and I don't think anyone expected either for them to make it or for them to make it back. Now, for those that were left behind, they must have felt like the world was ending for them, because the people that were left behind were already kind of not able to fend for themselves. And as what would be called the Forlorn Hope group disappeared over the crest of the hill, with it grew this shadow in their hearts of just not knowing if they were ever going to make it out of the situation. And time would pass, and all the people at the camp could do was support each other, have conversations of hope, of escape, you name it. Because the only thing that they were going to be doing in the meantime was slowly wasting away. One of the things that also seemed to be happening in and amongst the group was like a constant state of hypothermia. And it said that was playing into also like people's depression, melancholia, like the inability to think clearly. All these things are getting like super, super dire. As members of the group started to pass away, those that would survive were left with the hardest choice someone would have to make: to simply pass into death or to consume the calories that they would need from their deceased members. And this is where the people start to mentally go into despair. People are breaking down. And this is where an agreement is made that we promise you will not have to eat your own family. And the way they combated this was essentially, as people would succumb to the injuries, they would just, if it was your family, someone else ate them. And if it was someone else's family, someone else ate them. And this is the morality that worked for the group at the time. The Forlorn group, led by William Eddy and William Foster, volunteered to find help on foot. Virginia would watch them prepare, mixed with fear and hope. So, of the 15 people, they were the healthiest people in the camp, and they packed things that they could. They brought the little thin scraps of clothing they were able to get, a bit of boiled leather, makeshift snowshoes they crafted from oxbow wood and rawhide. Virginia would wait behind. and the Forlorn group would trek through some of the most brutal conditions the group would face, battling hunger, exhaustion, and relentless snowstorms. For the first 3 days, they were not even making a mile a day. The snow was so deep that all they ended up doing was making it a few hundred feet, having to take shelter, and the snow was essentially beating them back at every possible turn. And by about day 4 or 5, they completely ran out of food, and the morale of the group began to fall apart. As now they started to realize, they're not going to probably make their destination, they also can't really go back because they just got stuck again themselves in snow. And one of the members, Patrick Dolan, starts to become delirious from starvation. And he ends up on about the 9th day becoming completely erratic and essentially taking his clothes off, and they have to keep him from rolling into the fire. The guy has got into what's called paradoxical undressing, and he's just completely losing his mind. Now, this begins to happen again and again. As more members of the group are so hypothermic, they're losing their mind, or they just completely succumb to the elements. Now, as the members of the Forlorn group are dying from exhaustion and starvation, including Jay Fostick and Franklin Graves, they made the choice to start consuming their group members just like the other camps would be forced to do. Members took turns taking small portions, hoping that each little bite would give them strength, though something that seemed to be weighing heavily on everyone's conscience. So one of the things that ends up happening with the first couple people they start to consume is they don't take the whole person or the whole body, and they leave some of them behind, to the point where one of the points they actually trek back to start scavenging some of the bodies, and they realize this still isn't enough. Unfortunately, when you mix that desperation with people that are already not doing well mentally, things can get dangerous. So among the Forlorn Hope group were 2 Miwok guides, Luis and Salvador. So these Native Americans accompanied the group, and they became severely weakened and were no longer able to keep up pace with everyone else. So a very angry and disgruntled William Foster, gripped by desperations, ends up shooting and killing both men in their sleep. This act of survival and murder does not go over well with the group. Desperate as they were, they do end up consuming these 2 members, further fracturing any sense of humanity they had left, because now they weren't just eating for survival, they were murdering and eating people. And now they're about day 25 into their trip, and they keep pushing forward like a mile at a time. And they just happen to come across a group of Miwok villagers who end up taking pity on them, providing them with limited shelter and food and help guiding them towards safety. It's unbelievable to this group that they came across somebody like they were at the end of the rope. Now, unfortunately, the awkward part of this is that they end up realizing that the people that took them in were the villagers and companions of the person that they had just murdered and ate. Now, getting out and getting themselves to help isn't going to be the end of the struggle, because they have all these people left behind that they're sitting here thinking, like, how do we go back and get them? Because as you've just witnessed, it's just about impossible to navigate that mountain pass in the winter. So back at Truckee Lake, there was no way for Virginia Reed to know that the Forlorn Hope group had actually reached civilization. From their perspective, things would have been as bleak and desolate as ever, as their supplies had completely run out. And the only thing that was probably on their mind was that one day they might see somebody break over the horizon and come with food, supplies, you name it. And even more, the thoughts of her father, James Reed, filled their mind, wondering if he would ever come back for her. Now, James Reed, as we mentioned, was banished back in October from the group for killing John Snyder. And he was out there, he was facing the mountains alone. For him, Virginia's disobedience meant that she was able to supply him with some unlimited supplies and firearms. Now, Reed, he was able to actually end up pushing westward after he was banished. He endured harsh rain, cold nights, you name it. He was not only determined to reach California, not just for survival, but he had a fierce resolve to bring back help for his family, because at that point, as he was leaving the mountains, he saw the weather turn. He knew how bad the situation had gotten, So Reed was able to put together that the group was stuck because he's leaving the mountains and he's only by himself, so it's easier for him to travel and make time. He sees the weather set in and he knows that they're trapped with no supplies and that his kids and his wife are up there somewhere. And he's having none of it. So he ends up making it to a place called Sutter's Fort, where he pleads his case to local settlers and officials, recounting the peril that his group faced in the Sierra Nevada. Now at Sutter's Fort, Reed runs into a guy named William McCutcheon, and he was actually part of the Donner group who left and split off from them back in September. Now the intention was for McCutcheon to actually return to the group when they reached the Sierra Nevada mountains with supplies like food, flour, the main things that they're going to need to make that trek through the mountain, but he was unable to make it again due to the weather. So they never got those much needed supplies. Now with McCutcheon and Reed, they have a discussion about this whole thing and they decide to start mounting a rescue effort. It would be February of 1847, so another 2.5 months that the first rescue attempt was going to be made by Reed and McCutcheon. Now, fortunately for Reed, it's not long before February that Forlorn group had been able to make it out to that Miwok settlement. And because of that, they were able to get word to Fort Sutter that members of the group, including his family, were still alive. So this was the kick in the butt, I guess, everybody needed to really start going and looking for everybody. Now, back at the camps where the conditions had done nothing but worsen, 4 months essentially passed with them completely snowbound. Many of the group ended up succumbing to starvation exposure, and among the dead were children and adults alike, each loss striking a deeper blow than the remaining survivors. Those who were still alive had grown gaunt and hollow-eyed, they had scurvy, they were completely wasted from starvation, entire families torn apart, and survival had become just a daily fight against death. The Donners were among the worst off. They were trapped at Alder Creek, and George Donner ended up suffering from a severe infection, and his wife Tamsin remained by his side until the end. At Truckee Lake, Virginia Reed clung to what little hope she could find. Every face around her had the same look of resignation. Her mother was just an exhausted skeleton. All she could do was hold her children tight, offering them whispered assurances even as her own health began to fade. The few remaining adults that were alive rationed what little warmth and comfort they could, bundling the children together, sharing body heat, shielding them from the grim reality of what was approaching. In those 4 long months, over half of the party had succumbed to the hypothermia and starvation. Conditions of the camp had to be at the absolute worst by the time that Virginia was laying in her bed when all of a sudden she heard voices, clear, strong voices cutting through the frozen stillness. She sat up, her heart pounding, barely daring to believe it was real. Through the haze of hunger and exhaustion, she saw them. Was it members coming back from the Forlorn Hope group? Was it rescuers? Just weeks before the arrival of the Forlorn Hope group to the Miwok settlement and news making its way to just Reed that his family was still alive was the catalyst in getting a mass-scale rescue operation for the time underway. Now, what that meant was first sending out a probing party of 2 people who were super experienced in the mountains, because now in mid-February of 1847, the conditions were still treacherous. And 2 people by the names of Acuna and Riche ended up making the first trek into the mountains, and it said it was absolutely impossible of a trek. In spots, the snow was up to 20 feet deep. Now, they did bring with them basic supplies, but the party was completely unprepared for the number of survivors and the severity of the conditions. To be honest, I think they were going up to look for the majority of the group who had probably passed away. Now, they could only take the strongest with them because there was no being carried out of the mountains at that point. They were still going to have to walk out. And after assessing each person's strength, they would try to make the decision on basically who they could take and who they had to leave behind. And unfortunately, they did end up having to leave behind several children and elderly members of the group. She could barely walk, and each step was exhausting. It was said even at points that there was like blood trails in the snow from people's bleeding and like disfigured feet. Often, Some of the snowdrifts that they had to trudge through, like I mentioned, were like up to 10, 20 feet high, and rescuers really did encourage everyone to take it slowly. They walked single file, their bodies frail and their minds fatigued from the months of trauma. The rescuers did everything they could to ration what little food they had to keep the group fed without overfeeding them. These tiny portions of food, though, seemed like the world to the group. It would be an entire week of trekking through the snow with her starving body, exhausted mind, before Virginia would reach a place called Bear Valley, which was the first major point of safety that she'd probably seen in over 5 months. From here, they would gradually make it to Sutter's Fort, where she would be able to receive medical care, food, and shelter. It was in Bear Valley when Virginia would reunite with her father, James. Even though he had not been part of the initial rescue mission, he was anxiously waiting for survivors as they arrived. It's said that the reunion between the two was both emotional and powerful. When Virginia first saw him, she reportedly cried out, "Father," her voice weak from exhaustion and starvation. But the sight of him gave her the renewed sense of relief and safety. James Reed, who had feared for his family's survival for months, embraced her, overwhelmed to finally see both him and his wife alive. For James, who had worked tirelessly to organize the rescue efforts after reaching California, this reunion was a hard-won reward. Though bittersweet due to all the lives lost and the trauma that the family experienced, there was nothing like being back together. The Reed family was said to be one of the only families that actually survived this ordeal whole. And it said part of that is because of the mother, Margaret Reed's strict adherence to rationing food supplies and rotating warmth and fire, and like things that you needed to do in a survival situation. So not only do the two parents survive, also Virginia, 12, Patty Reed, who's only 8 years old at the time, James Reed, 5 years old, and Thomas Reed, their son, 3. Unbelievably, all of them survived. But many members of the group were still trapped on the mountain. And it was James who would lead and mount the second rescue expedition to go back. So it's here in March 1st of 1847, only a few weeks later, that James Reed himself sets out from Sutter's Fort, and he's determined to bring more people back. For Reed, this was not just personal. He wanted to, I think he felt a sense of responsibility to go back and try to make things right, because he was instrumental in making the decision to take the Hastings Cutoff on day 1. And he did still have some extended family that was left behind, his mother-in-law in particular. And I'm surprised, I wonder if he went back there. Surprised he didn't try to pull the thing like they did to the German guy and be like, "Oh no, the Pawnee's got your mother-in-law. Sorry, babe." I wonder if that would fly. Anyhow, so he goes back and he's driven. He wants to save the rest of the people that are back there. Now it's here in the second attempt where they're able to start taking some of the weaker people who couldn't get out themselves. So they come in more prepared with more equipment and things like that. And they're able to get some of the older or the younger people who were sick. And they actually end up not being able to get everyone and have to go back in March of 1847. And another group led by William Eddy and William Foster, both who had lost loved ones, unfortunately, were intent on bringing any remaining survivors out. But unfortunately, they would find even more casualties by the time that they returned. Again, few people still clinging to life, and were able to bring a few young members of both the Murphy and Graves family. But it's said that as the rescuers returned on the second and third times, like, it was horrific. There was body parts strewn about the campsites, as essentially just anyone that succumbed to the injuries was being cannibalized. And there's a story of one of the rescuers pulling up to one of the sites with the young children and just like basically seeing this kid gnawing on a body part sitting by the fire. Oh, I couldn't imagine it. Now, the last rescue attempt would actually be on April of 1847. So this is the final attempt to bring any survivors out. And here is where George Donner and his wife Tamsin were on the Alder Creek, I guess you would call it. And it's here that Tamsin Donner, George Donner's wife, is actually found alive, but George is at death's door and she refuses to leave her husband at Alder Creek. So the rescuers end up having to leave her behind, and she ends up succumbing and dying up there with George. Though both parents did end up perishing, The Donner children were able to be rescued in that last attempt. Among those chosen to leave were actually Virginia Reed and her mother because they were still healthy enough. But as they prepared to go, Virginia couldn't help but look back at the faces and friends of the family who would end up staying behind. When Virginia began her journey out of the camp, it was not going to be easy. The trek was literally hell. They were emaciated from weeks of starvation. She had little strength. So they're able to bring the Donner children out, which is great. Now they're able to also rescue a guy named Louis Keysburg from something called the Starve Camp, which was like another camp that formed of rescuers that were trying to rescue. Some ended up getting stranded and left behind. And this is where, when the rescuers find Louis Keysburg, he's said to be cannibalizing somebody. And he's the guy that kind of made became the infamous poster boy from, I guess you would say, the sensationalized version of cannibals in this story. It ruined his reputation, even though he was doing the same thing as everybody else. He got singled out for some reason. I think it looked like he was probably just enjoying it too much, is my guess. But yeah, so after all of those rescues attempts and getting everybody out, in total, 48 people would survive the ordeal and 39 ended up starving to death that winter. And I couldn't imagine the trauma that it caused for everybody. But the Virginia reuniting with her father, I can't believe at that moment how emotional it would have been literally for everybody. Back at the camp, as everybody that did survive starts to recover, as Virginia starts to slowly recover, the memories of the mountains would remain vividly etched into her mind. And the years would go by, but the experience of the Donner Party shaped her deeply, becoming both a source of pain and resilience. In the quiet moments, she would think back to the faces of those she had left behind. The sounds of the wind howling through the mountain passes, the sound of the snow falling in the trees, the horrific sound of people's death rattles as they passed one after one from starvation and hypothermia. She had stared into the darkness long enough, and she knew that she didn't want to stay there. She had faced darkness beyond what most people could ever imagine, despite she found the strength somehow to get her way out of it. And it was that defiant attitude, that decision of going against the group and getting her own father the supplies after he was kicked out, that allowed him to survive and allowed him to mount a rescue expedition in the face of so much adversity. Because one thing I didn't mention before is that the Mexican-American War had broken out, and he had to leverage everything he could and make deals to help and support things in the war to help get that rescue party sent up to help people. So this guy that decision for her to be defiant literally saved countless people's lives. Because the one thing that was clear is that I don't think if it wasn't for him, there would have been a rescue party going until the spring and not in February. Because yeah, it was so dangerous and you had a war breaking out, and I think they likely would have been left up there to fend for themselves. Now, despite the horrors that she would endure, Virginia chose not to let her story remain one of suffering alone. Virginia would go on to detail in a letter to her cousin titled Across the Plains, and here she tells about the hardships that her family went through, the rescue efforts, the feelings that overcame her. And in her later life, Virginia often emphasized time and time again, like, the positive aspects of the story. She didn't tell a story of cannibalization and people murdering each other. She instead just focused on survival, strength, and human endurance. What she survived at just 12 years old is just unimaginable. And she went on to live a fulfilling life. She became known not just for her story, but she married a fella named John, a cattle rancher in 1850 at 16 years old. And she ended up having 9 children together. And she was deeply devoted to her family, and her survival experience probably set her up for the rest of her life with discipline. I couldn't imagine how much this lady probably had her shit together from that experience for overcoming that. She said that she was a devout Catholic and basically attributed all of her survival to faith. Virginia Reed Murphy would go on to pass away on October 8, 1921, at the age of 89 years old. Can you imagine that 12-year-old girl sitting there on the brink of death, ever thinking that she would be here almost 80 years later, she would be sitting around her family with her kids and her husband? Like, I couldn't imagine it. As the ordeal of the entire Donner Party grew to a close, many would go on to share their stories and their different perspectives. Tragic story of the Donner Party became again like a classic story of hubris, a classic story of not flying too close to the sun. Like, taking that shortcut cost the lives of 38 people at the end of it. Trying to save 300 to 400 miles, the decision not to turn back. Like, these are tragic decisions that you've seen in other survival stories that I've told. Like, making the decision to turn back in nature has to be made way sooner than, say, the decision to turn back from going home from the mall. Because once things go a little bit wrong, it goes so bad so quickly. As soon as they lost those first supplies, honestly, it was probably time for them to turn around and go back. When their cattle started to dying, again, turn around, go back. When they found the note saying, don't go down the Hastings Cutoff, again, another sign for them to go back. When they lost a month going through there, another sign for them to turn around, go back, to do something. But again, it's this need to keep pushing further that gets us into trouble every single time. And this story is no different. Now, one of the interesting things is that after the crazy story of the Donner Party, people stopped using that Hastings Cutoff. Like, it was a no-go zone until the gold rush kicks off in California. Then all of a sudden, people forgot about the dangers of that trail, and it's opened up in the name of progress. And by 1850, people are going back and forth all the time. And for the people that would go on to tell their story and survive, this is just a crazy survival story. For those that did make it, I can't imagine for the rest of the group that had to sit there and eat their families. What a story. Thanks again for joining.